Well, I think we all know now why Santa only goes out one time a year. Here's your Christmas spot on McFarlane Toys' Twisted Xmas Mrs. Claus. McFarlane Monsters Action Figure Series 5 Twisted Christmas Mrs. Claus. Under the gaze of a pair of lecherous elves, the likes of which only McFarlane Toys can bring us, a sexed-up Mrs. Claus gyrates around the North Pole, wearing a sparkling lingerie set complete with furry hat and tall leather boots. She'll make your Christmas just a little bit more merry. Ho, ho, ho. I have my doubts that Mommy is kissing Santa Claus when Santa Claus is coming home to this. Before, of course, we get a closer look at the Twisted Christmas Mrs. Claus, let's grab the tape measure and see how tall the figure stands. You'll have to really include as well the candy cane pole that she's gyrating around. Of course, because all the pieces are intact as one piece, you really can't have her displayed on her own. Including that, of course, and the elf on top. You're looking at Mrs. Claus totally being about 9 3/4 of an inch in height, or she's going to be about 25 centimeters tall. Totally. Sliding now, though, over Mrs. Claus and freeing up a little bit of available space next to her, we can bring in her holiday husband, Santa Claus. Comparing, though, the two, I really don't understand how these two even combine. I mean, I know they say opposites attract, but really, look at the site that Santa Claus is in. He must have a really good personality. Or, of course, it also helps as well that he has a big giant toy shop. You got to imagine that's bringing in some money as well. Now, Mrs. Claus is quite a lot taller. Proportionally, she's a lot leaner as well than Santa. And, of course, if you also include the candy cane that she's attached permanently to, then the figure is also quite a lot taller than Santa Claus we looked at earlier as well. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say that she's permanently attached to the candy cane, but she is certainly requiring the candy cane in order to stand properly. Of course, some assembly was required when I first took her out of her clamshell casing. She has to be installed. I think, in fact, actually, now that I'm looking at it, she was already part of this part of the candy cane. I think from what I remember is I had to add this part of the candy cane as it attaches only to the top. It's basically attached by a peg here. And then one thing you also had to add was the elves down below here. The elves are one thing. This one, at least, elf, is attached inside of a box. I'm going to just remove the box for right now. We're going to put back down Mrs. Claus. I know everybody's anxious to see Mrs. Claus. Hold on a second. We'll get to her in a moment. First, one thing we'll have a look at, though, is the elf that's inside the box that says, do not open till Christmas. I would imagine he couldn't have waited. I don't think there's also any air holes anywhere other than just the hole that's on the bottom of it, because that's going to plug on actually to the display base. There's one long peg that fits then right into the hole. If you just fit it into the hole of the box alone, the actual box kind of it doesn't sit securely enough. So unfortunately, what you have to do is, I'm just going to remove the elf from inside. That's what actually the box looks like. There's a hole, a peekaboo hole. Hi, I could see you, Mrs. Claus. But this hole isn't just enough to hold and stabilize the elf. They had to do, unfortunately, one better, and they had to take the poor elf and drill a hole on the bottom of his behind. If you line the two up, if you put them back, obviously back into the box, and you have to line the two holes accordingly, then it sits properly then onto the peg. There's been a few times I've just carelessly kind of put them on the hole as it is, and without even properly lining up everything, yeah, it sits a little looser. So you really want to make sure that everything is lined up, and unfortunately you have to take the peg, and of all places, it has to go through the hole of the box, and then of course through the hole of the elf. Ouch. Getting a closer look, though, at the elf, it does certainly look like something Jim Henson would have designed, either from, of course, what was that movie? The Crystal... What was that? I can't remember what was the name of that movie? The puppet one that had to do with the crystals. Was it the Dark Castle? Dark Crystal. I'm drawing a complete blank. It also reminds me of something I would have also expected to see from Labyrinth. A very long nose, very pointed ears on the back. And he's also getting himself quite the show when you see really the way that she's actually angled. The elf also has a permanently attached box lid to the top of his head that's not removable. And then you're just going to take everything else and line it up. I want to make sure, of course, you got it facing the right way. And then, again, like that peg literally fits. It has to fit through two holes to have it stable and properly in place. Now, we're just going to move that out of the way for right now. I'm going to pick up Mrs. Claus. I did want to show you guys what the display stand looks like. The display stand is close enough in color. I'm just going to put Santa to the side here. I'm going to grab his display stand. Santa's, though, is a little bit dirtier of snow, whereas Mrs. Claus keeps her snow a little whiter, certainly a lot more bluer. The bottom of it actually is all cast here in blue plastic, but then they've gone and frosted the top of it. It certainly looks, though, a lot cleaner than Santa Claus's display stand. And instead of actually having a strung of little jingle bells or sleigh bells, Santa actually or Mrs. Claus, I should say, actually has these unwrapped sections of the ribbon that would be just a continuation, of course, of the box. Basically, the idea is of, he would have opened up the box and just sort of just laid the ribbon all around him. Now, one thing you'll see is the way that they've actually got the elf displayed. The elf is getting a bit of a show for free, it seems. He's looking right up into, of course, the, what would you call it, the undercarriage of Mrs. Claus. Getting, though, a closer look at Mrs. Claus. Actually, one other thing we'll look at, too, is the fact she comes included with a tiny little North Pole post. And that fits into just a little opening groove there. Just slides in place like that. I think that was the only other thing that had to be installed to this. Other than, again, like, the box had to be put right there. I know, get right to Mrs. Claus, and this little piece right here as well. One thing also, just before looking at Mrs. Claus, I wanted to show you the other elf that's taken a peek. This one's hanging from the top of the candy cane pole. And you may also notice as well that there's a string of mistletoe just in front of him. He seems to be red. I don't know if he's red from just being shy. I mean, he's looking literally just at Mrs. Claus. It's not like he's even hiding himself either. Or it could also just be the blood that's rushing to the top of his head because, of course, he's hanging upside down. Getting, though, now finally a closer look at Mrs. Claus. I think there was also two variations of this one as well. The more easily to find one that was in retail at one point had the more brunette version of Mrs. Claus, but there was also one that was blonde, and I think there was also one that had more orange hair, and those were McFarlane's site store exclusives. I never really got around to picking up those other two because, honestly, really between the three hairstyles and hair colors, I really think that the brunette works the best for Mrs. Claus. I think it works the best with her color scheme. I also think it works better as well with the eyeshadow that she has. I just think the darker hair looks better with Mrs. Claus than maybe the other two colors. The blonde I thought was just a little too pale. Maybe at some point if I can find that one at a decent price, I might still decide to pick that one up. I really like this one, I think, the most of all three of them. She attaches in three places. Her hands, if you can look at them, are actually on pegs. They line up with then the holes that are on the sides of the candy cane. You really only have to worry about one of them because the other one is still attached by the clear elastic that was wrapped around this the first time I even took this figure out of her tray. I've yet to really cut the elastic, and because it's clear, I'm fine just to leave it the way it is. It kind of helps to keep everything in place. If I was to cut that, for example, I'm probably sure what I would see inside is another peg that would attach to the side of the candy cane. But the clear elastic does a much better job of keeping everything secure. The other thing that she has to attach onto, just going to lift the figure's feet out of the way here for a second. She has one peg right here. For a while, I actually had Mrs. Claus more straight like this, but the correct way of actually having her is to angle her. And if you look at it, on the bottoms of her 1 foot at least, she does have a hole right there, and then that lines up then to the peg. So she's actually more on an angle, so of course the elf can get a bit of a show. Now, the actual design of Mrs. Claus is quite, I don't want to say tantalizing. It certainly is a little bit more seductive, that's for sure. She has very little in the way of clothing. She has, of course, a Santa's hat, which I think is actually the most amount of clothing that she actually has. The Santa hat, though having softer plastic, is not removable. You can't take it off the top of her head. She has more than lingerie for the top of her top. And, of course, she also has a little furry rim, like a little trim down below there as well. Both the trim that's just underneath her bra and also the trim that she has around, like, her panties, so to speak, are all more of a frosted clear plastic. But then they've gone and painted those areas with a little bit of white to add a little bit of nice little white fur. Really, really nice. This is a very loose piece. This is so you can, I'm sure, lift this up really if you wanted to. You can see that she seems to be wearing, I don't know if that's a holly lingerie, possibly, judging by the greenery that I'm seeing right there. There's a little bit there that they've painted in green. Also for the garter belt, she's also got a little bit of green there also on the top. And then she has tights or stockings down below here with, I guess that would be knee-high boots with a few little sleigh bells, jingle bells there on the front. These jingle bells are always prone to breaking, so if you ever want to say, for example, try to track down Mrs. Claus and get her loose, you may want to just check and make sure that all of these bells in place. From the times that I've had these, I usually store them away and then I bring them out for Christmas time. Luckily, knock on wood, all of the bells have yet to be broken, but they're nicely painted there as well in silver. Spinning finally the figure around, you can also see as well, like they've sculpted the figure really nicely, painting all the pieces where they need to be painted. Again, she really doesn't have much in the way of clothing, but the clothing at least that she does actually have looks really good on the figure. Let's put her right down here for a second. We'll get, of course, the elf. We'll just put him in place also as well. And then we'll bring back in Santa Claus. Mrs. Claus, for me, is my favorite figure. Actually, no, that's not true. She's sort of tied, I feel, with Frosty. Frosty and Mrs. Claus are my favorite from this set. I'm always, of course, when it comes to displaying these, though, on my mantle, I used to display them on my mantle. I'm realizing now I can't. I'm not allowed to. But these usually then go into my office during the holiday season. I always put them out on display. And then usually at the beginning of the year, like into January, I pack them back away until they see light of day again the following Christmas. Again, really nice looking Christmas characters. I mean, they sort of take the elements of a holiday classics with, of course, Mr. Claus, Santa Claus himself, Mrs. Claus, and they do a bit of a spin to it. I mean, never in my wildest dreams would I ever really picture Mrs. Claus dressed like this. She's a little young also as well. I mean, generally when I'm seeing Mrs. Claus ever being featured in films, she's usually a little bit older. She looks more like a more grandma type. This is definitely not one that looks like a grandmother, but certainly one I could certainly see why Santa Claus wants to stay home most of the time. He only goes out really one time a year, and really, can you blame him if he, again, is coming home to someone looking like this? Not only is Mrs. Claus tied with Frosty as my favorites from the Twisted Xmas line, but I think she's also one of the most expensive. Checking a few weeks ago on eBay, one listing showed up for a sealed Mrs. Claus, and it was going for about $115. Granted, that was Canadian prices, so if I backtracked that a bit, it probably would have been more into the 70s or 80s US. Still, it's pretty expensive to get a figure that's about 17 years old, because I think these all came out around 2007, but they are available. It's just a matter of finding one for a good price. If you're really lucky enough, you might even be able to find somebody who's selling an entire lot for... Again, the last time I saw a lot on eBay for the entire wave of these, I think they were going for about $285. So that's a bit steep. Or you're lucky enough maybe to find a strip plaza comic book store that just happens to have a few straggling figures laying on the shelves or on the walls. Maybe you might be able to find a Mrs. Claus that way. I'm still interested at one point to find the blonde-haired version, and I think there was also an orange version, haired version of Mrs. Claus, but I'm not in any rush to get those. If I happen to find them, great. I can keep them sealed and I can put them on the wall. If I don't find them, though, I'm just content to have the brunette version of Mrs. Claus, because I really think it's the best of the three hairstyles. What do you guys think of the figure? Let me know down below in the comments section. Have you been collecting the Twisted Xmas figures? Whether they be loose, whether they be sealed. I think the last time we looked at the Santa Claus, a few comments down below did actually say that they had a few of them still sealed. Congratulations. I kind of wish, in retrospect, buying these for the price that I did, I wish I bought two of them. One to keep a set sealed, and then have the other set loose that I can put out every holiday season. If you guys enjoyed this video, I want to hit with a like. If you guys are loving the content you guys are seeing, and you certainly would like to stick around for the future re-reviews of the Twisted Xmas figures, I think we still have 4 to go through, right? We looked at Mr. Claus, Santa Claus. We also looked at Mrs. Claus. There's Jack Frost, there's Rudolph, there's Frosty, and then there's Santa's elves, or Santa's helpers. So I think there's another 4 that we're still going to be looking at. But rest assured, we will be looking at those in upcoming reviews. The key to making sure that you're not missing a beat on any of those is by hitting the subscribe button down below and turning on the bell notification. And of course, as always, keep your Christmas peepers peeled to this channel. Thanks for watching. See you guys next time.